This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. Today I'd like to share from an experience I had when I was a young man, and I want to share it because of thinking about just the amount of nationalism that we're experiencing right now, which is of a competitive nature, and remembering and thinking about some of my experiences in coming into contact, particularly with Eastern European and Russian culture. When I was 17, 18-year-old, I was living in Georgia in the southeast of the United States, and I was just beginning to have the inner capacity to really delve into really long works of literature. And I got my hands on the brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And I remember lying by our fireplace in our house in Georgia and just reading, being totally consumed by this story, particularly impressed by two characters, Ivan and Alyosha, two of the brothers in the story. A story about love and crime, but also deep existential questions about being human. Later, I went on to spend some time in the Ukraine, got some impressions of the Soviet Union, even though, of course, it had already dissolved at that point, but began to become more interested in Eastern European history and philosophy, literature, art, religion. And I eventually came across the work of one of the great, brilliant Russian philosophers named Vladimir Soloviev. And I'd like to just share a little bit some of the ways that he impressed me and also kind of opened me up to think about things in a way that was totally out of my normal way of thinking coming from the United States. And as one example of how art and a certain way of approaching different cultures can actually inspire a kind of respect instead of just confrontation, out of my own life, and as an ideal that I still hold and try to encourage. So Vladimir Soloviev, of course, not very well known necessarily in the West, but one of the great Russian thinkers and very famous in his time. And I later learned that Dostoevsky himself had attended some of Soloviev's brilliant, famous lectures and read his works. And Soloviev was a person who, as an adult, kind of lived out of a suitcase. And he spent his time, it is said, playing with children and socializing during the day. And in the evening, he would work. And he had this kind of inner dedication to his own practice as his spiritual ideals. And part of them were extremely ascetic. So it had a lot to do with self-discipline, which really impressed me also as a young man. And I learned that Dostoevsky had in part based two of his characters from his novels, brothers Karamazov, namely Alyosha and Ivan, a young, idealistic, striving Alyosha who's has somehow a pure and open heart, and Ivan, someone who's encountered deep skepticism and cynicism and is super intelligent and also wrestles with some of the most difficult questions around power and morality in the novel and some of the discussions. Both of these figures were inspired evidently in part by Vladimir Soloviev, who himself is this impressive, enigmatic figure. Now, I've mentioned a little bit about him already. You see there are photographs of him. He has this long beard, also long hair, and in many photographs of his older years. And he was already recognized as brilliant as a young man and went on to write numerous philosophical works and teach as a lecturer and professor. And yet he had this kind of almost like public monastic life. As I said, it's described by one of his biographers that he would spend the day really in connection with people and not working as that hard, but at night he would study and he would write, and that he had a kind of practice that when he would get sleepy at night when he was studying, he actually wouldn't even lie down, but he would just place his hand on his desk and he would situate a candle in between two fingers and he would light it, and then he would let himself go to sleep briefly. And when the candle burned down and burned his hand, it would wake him up and he would continue his work. And this may seem grotesque to some people, but one of the things that I saw in this, also through his writing and his poetry, was an idealism, a kind of idealism for self-determination and discipline, and not kind of falling into a lethargy of the needs of comfort, so to say, which included sleep. Now, it's pretty extreme, but also obviously in a way deeply inspiring too, this commitment that he made to himself. He was an extremely empathetic person, and besides being intellectually brilliant, and had a great sense of humor. And one of the things that in my 20s, when I got back from the Ukraine, I set myself the task, after having read some of his smaller philosophical works, to read his last philosophical work, the larger one, The Justification of the Good. And this work also just impressed me so deeply in its 3 parts. And some of the things that really rubbed me in a way that I wasn't used to, dissonant for coming out of the United States, was his view that it was impossible for him to consider the state as existing independently and with its own kind of authority outside of the concept of the church and the divine. And this came out of his kind of theological view of things, that, and a mystical view of things, that because the divine encompassed also all governments, the whole world, that there was no way to imagine that in the end a state created by, let's say in his case, Christian nation, would not consider itself subservient to God. Now, this was so radical for me, coming from the United States, where one of the great proud moments in our history is the separation of the church from the state, and the belief that this is really important also to protect spirituality, so to say, but also to protect people within the state. And yet, through reading Soloviev, somehow, because of his sincerity, his creativity, his obvious total individuality, I was able to really feel into and live into where he was coming from, and a kind of theocratic vision. And it's definitely not something that I embraced or wanted to espouse, but it was possible for me to experience a totally different view on things through Soloviev. Another wonderful work that he wrote is about love and sexuality, and he writes about it in a way where he tries to read actually the kind of meaning of love, and also romantic love, out of the sexuality of the human being, but also how it's connected with like the sexuality of frogs, the sexuality of insects, the sexuality of higher mammals. And it was such a creative book because it was this kind of Christian Platonic vision of things, but totally connected to observations about nature. It also intrigued me very deeply. And to this day, I'm an admirer of Soloviev and really am nourished by reading him and exploring his ideas, even if I wouldn't necessarily promote them, particularly some of his political ideas. But there is a kind of experience that was possible for me to have through being exposed, one, to Russian literature, but also being able to journey to the Ukraine in my case, and to have a meeting with another culture and nation in a way that was able to inspire, despite deep, deep differences, a kind of admiration. And I think this is something that the arts can offer us, that when I reflect on my own biography, how much appreciation and respect can flow out of meeting other nations through their culture instead of merely at negotiations about trade deals or tariffs or territory or natural resources. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and it is the thought that I wanted to share in this episode. Questions of Courage is very simple, small production. It's a collaboration between the youth section and Goetheanum communications team. It's very easy to produce. However, support is needed for everything we do. The Goetheanum is a project that has been made possible by generations of people who have enthusiastically volunteered, given, and supported it in its various stages. And I invite you too to consider giving a gift. And anything you give will go to support youth work in the youth section, either at the Goetheanum or in one of the youth groups around the world.